Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to session 2 of Judaism's Ancient and Ongoing Roots in Israel. I'm Kate Lukaszowicz, the Education Programs Director at Classrooms Without Borders. In order to cultivate a sense of community, we invite you to turn on your cameras and to remember that you will be muted during the Zoom. We're grateful to host educators on this Zoom who are earning professional development credits for their learning. Consequently, the program may differ slightly from what we usually experience with Avi, but he will still be expertly leading the content while he suggests instructional ideas for the educators. This offers a novel experience for our community of lay people to see firsthand the quality of professional learning that CWB offers to its educators. For the educators among us, thank you for making time on a Sunday to join us, and for all that you do for your students every day. If you are an educator certified in Pennsylvania, in a few moments, I will drop into the chat the link to register your PPID number so that we can award you Act 48 credits. This program, like so many others that CWB offers, is free for its audience. If you are so inclined, we would be grateful for any contributions that allow us to continue offering high quality events at no cost. I'll drop that into the chat also. In today's session, we have the unique opportunity to consider multiple narratives, exploring both the Jewish-Israeli and Arab-Palestinian perspectives, including the conflicts between these two groups and the rise of Jewish and Arab nationalism as we think about the tensions between these two groups. Our scholar today is Avi Ben Hur, a Brooklyn native who moved to Israel in 1983. Avi's expertise lies in the geopolitical issues underlying the Arab-Israeli conflict, interfaith encounters, world Jewish heritage, and Holocaust studies. As a scholar in residence for Classrooms Without Borders, Avi has lectured, taught, and facilitated workshops in the United States, Warsaw, Prague, Berlin, Spain, Italy, Austria, and Greece. If you have any questions for Avi, please feel free to message him directly via the chat function. Without further delay, I invite my dear friend and most excellent collaborator, Avi Ben Hur, to share his expertise with us. Thank you, Avi.
Thank you, Kate. Welcome, everybody. It's 8:05 p.m. here in Jerusalem. So just in case you don't recall that I'm actually doing this from Israel, not from Pittsburgh. And hopefully everybody can hear me okay. So I'm being asked to do something which is kind of a tall order today, which is to do a 50,000, like zoom out and give a kaleidoscopic view of the Arab-Israeli conflict from 50,000 feet. I think that one of the misconceptions about the conflict is that it's been going on for a really, really long time. You know, some people say for 1,000 years, some say for hundreds of years. Actually, I want to tell you that the conflict has been going on for slightly more than 100 years. To be precise, I would say 103 years. That's number one. So that's a really long time, but it's not hundreds of years, like, for example, what happened in Ireland, okay? And, you know, it's not a clash between Islam and Christianity, which also took a very long time. It's slightly more than 100 years. There were, when we look at casualties, and if I don't include the present war in the list, both sides, all sides together, all partners to this conflict in the last 103 years have lost no more than maximum 125,000 people. I don't mean per player. I mean everybody. Israelis, Palestinians, Egyptians, Iraqis, Jordanians, Syrians, Lebanese. Leave everybody out? Okay. All told, in the Arab-Israeli conflict, less than 125,000 people. Now, every human being is important, no less important than I am. But in 103 years, 125,000 people, and it's less than that, okay? I'm giving a very expansive. If I give the conservative estimate, it's more to the tune of 122,000. And that's before the present one. And if I throw in the present one, so we're going to get to a little over 150,000. Again, in 103 years of conflict, okay? And, you know, not, without disparaging any of the people who were killed, who had died, think about World War I or any given day of World War II. Think about what happened in Syria, the course of a decade, our neighbors. Rwanda. I mean, I can go on and on and on. Different conflicts that have taken place in our lifetimes. And for some reason, the Abu Dhabi conflict it's a lot more exposure, okay, and a lot more emphasis than virtually any other conflict, but it is what it is. And I think that in order for me to deliver today, that is to say, give you a kaleidoscopic view of the conflict, instead of going into specific battles and instead of going to every single war, one after the other, because there's a lot of wars, and I'll just be inundating you with too much information. Okay, I think that it's best that we kind of really zoom out and look at several themes, some guiding themes to understand the big picture. Okay, and I think that the first thing that we need to deal with, and when I put up the PowerPoint, we'll deal with it directly, is the issue of the rise of nationalism in the Middle East. That is to say, and here I hope everybody understands this, nationalism as an ideology, as an international force, is a new phenomenon. It's a new phenomenon from literally the tail end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th centuries. It's very, very new, nationalism. Okay, that's number one. Number two, national movements per se rose, all of them, in the 19th century. I say all of them. Obviously, there are national movements that rose in the 20th century, but I'm talking about national movements that we take for granted, okay, rose in the 19th century. So Italy was unified in the middle of the 19th century. Germany, 1871. Greece, 1832. As you have a whole slew of countries that we take for granted today that emerged as nation states during the 19th century as a result of the rise of nationalism as an ideology. Okay, so one of the things I have to talk about here is the rise of Jewish nationalism and the rise of nationalism in the Middle East. Please note, I didn't say Arab nationalism. I deliberately did not use that term, and you'll understand why, because the Middle East is not just Arabs. Okay, and we'll have to understand it as well, because at base, when we look at the conflict, there are two parallel conflicts that also overlap dramatically. Okay, one is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that is to say, and I'll put it more visually in front of you in a few minutes. There are two peoples, two nations, both of them have legitimate claims on a very, very small piece of real estate between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And that is a conflict that's been going on for 103 years. And that's what we're seeing also right now as I speak. Okay. But we also have the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is a conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors, meaning Israel, Lebanon, Israel, Syria, Israel, Jordan, Israel, Iraq, believe it or not, Israel, Iran, not a neighbor and not Arab, Israel, Jordan, I don't know if I mentioned Jordan, Israel, Egypt. So these are non-Palestinian nation states, okay? And we also have to wrap our heads around, okay, so we have this conflict and the other conflict, where do they meet, where do they converge, where do they diverge? This is also important in our story. So again, I'm laying out the parameters. I'm going to try to the best of my capacity to keep these parameters. We also need to throw in the international arena. That is to say that from the get-go, the international arena has engaged and has been very much a moving force in the conflict. So whether we're talking about the British who divided up the Middle East after World War I, okay, if we're talking about the Cold War and the United States and its allies and the USSR and its allies and how it impacted. So this is very, very important. This is on an international level. The international arena is very, very important till today. We also have something that is probably a lot on most of your minds now, but it's totally irrelevant to the conflict before 1979. And that is the so-called Shiite axis versus a Sunni axis. We'll have to wrap our heads around that as well, because that has also now been introduced into the conflict, but this is not something that was part of the conflict whatsoever before 1979. And we have to talk about that as well. Okay. We also have to talk about major intersections, okay, or turning points, okay, that have impacted the conflict dramatically. For example, World War I. For example, World War II and the Holocaust. For example, the war in 1948 and its results. For example, the war in 1967 and its results. Okay, détente, the Islamic Revolution in Iran. So all these kinds of events, okay, very, very important in terms of turning points and how they've impacted First Intifada, Second Intifada, all these different things, these issues are things we're gonna have to represent. So we have a lot on our plates, okay, and we're gonna kind of jump in now and do the best we can. So I'm gonna share with you PowerPoint. You should be able to see it fairly soon. Okay, so here we go. So let's start off with just some geography, because for many of you, this is not your geography, which is fine, but it's important. So what we're looking at here is a kind of a really big zoom out, okay, of the Middle East. You see tiny Israel here smack in the center, but also you see some of the big players around Israel. This is kind of important to show you because you can see Iran and you can also see Yemen, okay, because it's relevant today, literally today, these players on this side. So I just wanted to get this, and now we'll do a little bit of a zoom in the immediate neighborhood, and you can see that Israel, a very, very small country, is bordered in the north by Lebanon, the northeast by Syria, the east Jordan, the south Egypt. Okay, you're seeing it, and of course, there are also territories. We're gonna have to relate to that as well. So this is the region, okay, of the Middle East, and now let's kind of jump into it. The last time we met, we were dealing with the connection of the Jewish people, 3,000 years of the Jewish connection to the land of Israel, and kind of stopped on just the beginning, just on the edge of the rise of Zionism. Let's put that aside for a second. And I want to talk about the birth of nationalism in the Arab Middle East. So just to remind all of you, the Ottoman, Turkish, Islamic Empire basically ruled almost the entire Middle East for some 400 years. The Ottoman Turks are Turks, they're Turkoman, they're not Arabs, they're Muslims, but they're not Arabs. And they, of course, did not really want to allow any kind of rise of Arab nationalism. The Ottoman Turks, certainly in the 19th century, were faced with tens of various ethnic religious groups that wanted to, tear away from the Ottoman Empire and achieve independence. And so this is part of the story. I started off telling you that nationalism was born as a significant power in international relations in the 19th century. And what's going to happen in the Middle East is that the Ottoman Empire, which was in deep decline, tried to modernize. And part of modernizing was also bringing printing presses, okay, and the superpowers of the day, 19th century, which was not America, okay, the superpowers, which are the British, the French, the Germans, later on, the Germans, were getting more and more involved. The European powers are getting more and more involved in the Middle East. And what's going to happen is the Arab intellectuals are going to absorb ideas of nationalism. Some of them actually go to study in Paris or in London, and they absorb the ideas of nationalism, and they begin to look at their own people, and they see the following. Since all national movements always look back in history at the glorious past of any specific people or nation, the Arabs, who had a lot to look back to, okay, so they look back 1,000 years, they were ahead of the curve in technology, in sciences, okay, in calligraphy, in arts, in architecture, okay, not even 1,000 years, you even go back 500-600 years. But their situation in the 19th century was one of being way, way, way behind the Europeans, and a deep sense of humiliation. Okay, so we're going to start to see also an emphasis on the language of Arabic. Very, very important. Every national movement puts a significant emphasis on language as part of an identifying factor in a nation, in an ethnos. And the Arabs were not different in this sense, nor were the Jews with Zionism, okay, who adopted Hebrew. And so Arabic becomes very, very important as a language and creating literature, but also there's a sense that they're humiliated. And they're beginning to suffer from European colonialism, but also Ottoman Turkish colonialism. That's their sense. Now, what's going to emerge in the 19th century, particularly, let's say, in the last third of the 19th century, or three different trends or models of nationalism in the Arab Middle East. One, which we're going to call Pan-Arabism, the sense was they're looking towards one great big Arab state. The glue, the ethnos, the Arab ethnos, the glue is language, culture, civilization. Okay, where would the capital of that big Arab state be? Well, that was something up for debate or up for grabs. Baghdad, maybe, because Iraq, well, not Iraq, but Baghdad had been the capital of a great Abbasid Caliphate. Damascus, okay, the capital of the first great Muslim Caliphate. Okay, so maybe it's greater Syria, maybe it's greater Iraq. Perhaps it should be in Cairo, okay, in Egypt, and so on and so forth. But the idea was the glue, the national glue would be the Arab language, civilization, and culture, okay, and it would be one great Arab state. The second trend, okay, Pan-Islam, the glue is Islam, okay, and here it's interesting because this would now go beyond just the Arabs, obviously, because the Middle East also has plenty of non-Arab peoples who are Muslims, not Arabs. And I'll just give you one big example that you're all familiar with: the Kurds. The Kurds are not Arabs. The Kurdish language is not Arabic. They're Muslims. By the way, they're also Kurdish Jews and they're Kurdish Christians, and so on and so forth. But let's say the majority of the Kurds are Muslims, but there's certainly none of them are Arabs ethnically, but they would be included in this kind of Pan-Islam, if you will, as were Turkmen, okay, and so on and so forth. Okay, the tricky part here would be when you're talking Pan-Islam, you're talking Pan-Sunni Islam, not Pan-Shiite Islam, because the overwhelming majority of the Muslims then and today it's 85% are Sunni and only 15% are Shiite. Okay, and the third trend was a very particularistic state or country nationalism. And here, I think that the country that stands out most as an early adopter would be Egypt, because Egypt already, Egypt was being ruled by the British, but from 1882 onward. But Egypt, looked at its past, at its pre-Islamic past, also the pharaohs and the pyramids, everything, all these things with not a little pride, with a lot of pride. And so there already was, let's say, an Egyptian kind of nationalism, which is very particularistic. So these are the three trends, okay? And of course, the question here is, where do the Palestinians fit in? Let's hold that thought for a moment, because I want to talk for 30 seconds, just for 30 seconds, about Jewish nationalism. And I'm picking up where I left off in our last presentation last week. So essentially, starting from 1881, where most of the Jews in the world were living under the Tsarist Empire, which was an abusive one, you started having state-sponsored attacks under the Russian Tsars on the Jewish population. These are known as pogroms, and they start to take off. We have waves and waves of pogroms starting from 1881. And this is going to cause a huge migration of Jews who are going to march with their feet. They're going to pull out of the Tsarist Empire. Please note, I'm not saying Russia, because the Tsarist Empire would include what today would be Russia, Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, all the Baltic states, large parts of Romania, all of Poland, and so on and so forth. A lot of different countries, today different countries. Then it was all under the Tsarist Empire. We're looking at, over the course of just about 40 years, you're going to have a little over 2.5 million Jews will leave the Tsarist Empire. And I don't know, 98% or 99% are going to head west. And when I say west, I mean literally west. They're either going to end up in Austro-Hungarian Empire, like Central Europe, or they're going to end up in Germany, or they're going to go to England, France, okay, Netherlands, okay, those areas, Belgium, or they're going to head for South Africa, or they're going to head for Australia. That's not exactly West, North, South Africa, or they're going to head for North America or South America. The core of American Jewry arrived in these years. between 1881 and 1924, the core of American Jewry. There were Jews in America before that. Okay, I know that, but the core, the overwhelming majority of American Jewry, and this would be true of Canadian Jewry as well, okay, arrived between 1881 and 1924, okay, in this huge wave. Less than 1% headed for Ottoman Palestine, okay, the land of Israel, with a different idea. And this is going to be the beginning of Zionism. And again, picking up where I left off last week, where I said that Jews were a nation in a national sense. Everybody accepted that idea 250 years ago, and that broke down over the French Revolution. But towards the end of that same century, the end of the 19th century, there were Jews who found that they were not being, they couldn't integrate, and they were going back to their roots. And so they began in dribs and drabs to start to emigrate to Palestine, starting from 1882. This is the first one's called the first Aliyah, the first wave of immigration. Okay, and we don't have a movement yet, a political movement to Zionism with an ideology and with a program and with a vision. We have from 1897 under Theodor Herzl. Okay, we have people actually practicing Zionism without actually having a completely a full idea of what they're looking for. Okay, there are people emigrating and building agricultural communities, but they don't necessarily have a state in mind. That it's not a fully developed program, political program. That's where Herzl steps in, okay? And he lays out his program in 1897. Now, this, of course, brings us to the Palestinians. And the question is, when do we have a Palestinian national movement? Because at base, when we talk about the conflict, we're talking about a conflict between, first and foremost now, two peoples, okay? Jews and Arabs in a very small area, okay, in the land of Israel, in Palestine, okay, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. So we started talking about the rise of Arab nationalism. What about Palestinian nationalism? The reality is that you do not really have a specific, particularistic Palestinian nationalism, a real one, until 1920. Okay, and this, of course, would raise the question, what happened in 1920? Or the first question would be, so if you were to land, okay, in, I don't know, Jerusalem or in Jaffa in the year 1900 and grab an Arab by the lapels and say, who are you? What is your national identity? He or she would give one of the following answers in 1900. It was in Jaffa. They'd say, I'm an Ottoman subject. They may say, I'm a Syrian. They may call themselves, they'd say, I'm from Jaffa, like a local identity. They would probably say they're an Arab and a Muslim, if they're Muslim, maybe they're Christian, okay? They wouldn't call themselves a Palestinian. They wouldn't really know what that meant, because it didn't mean anything in 1900. There is no identity like that, a specific identity. The nationalism that was accepted by the elites in Ottoman Palestine at the end of the 19th and beginning of 20th centuries, and most of the region, was actually a pan-Arab one that looked towards a greater Syria that would include parts of Iraq, all of Syria as we know it, all of Jordan as we know it, all of Lebanon as we know it, all of Israel and the territories as we know it. That would be greater Syria. That is what they subscribed to. That's what they wanted. What happened in 1920? Essentially, in 1920, the idea of a greater Syria collapsed. And it collapsed because in a deal between the British and the French got control over Syria and Lebanon. And the Arab leader who went to Damascus to take his seat on the throne and to start getting the ball going was deposed. King Faisal was deposed by the French, and his compensation package was to get Iraq. British gave him Iraq in lieu of that, instead of that. And that is the end of greater Syria, okay, at that moment. And then you start seeing the rise of local specific Palestinian particularistic nationalism. Now, this is not to say that you don't have Palestinian Arabs in the country who are concerned and worried about the arrival of Jews, okay? And certainly Palestinian intellectuals read and knew the Zionist program and didn't like it and were opposed to it. but they didn't have a plan for a Palestinian state. They knew what they were opposed to. The question is, what were they for? Before 1920, they weren't for a separate Palestinian state. They were for a greater Syria. Okay, and I'm speaking now not as a Zionist, I'm speaking now in their mouth, okay, when you read their readings of what they were looking for. And this is important. Now, I want to tarry for a second, because there's something I didn't say earlier, which I think is very important, okay? When you look at the Pan-Islam, one of the issues or questions, I think big questions, macro questions about the Arab-Israeli conflict is the question of the role of religion in the conflict. So I want to say something very basic, which I think you all know, but I think it's important to emphasize. So national conflict can either have or not have a religious element. Sometimes national conflict, the basis, okay, or one of the strongest elements of it is a religious conflict, but not always. When you take a look at what's happening now between Russia and Ukraine, it's not a religious conflict. Most of them are the same, coming from the same Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox churches. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church are not really dissimilar churches, okay? And that's not a religious conflict. Ireland, religious conflict, Catholics and Protestants, right? So you do have, for sure, national conflicts that are religious, but there are plenty of national conflicts that have nothing to do with religion. Like, what happened in Rwanda was tribal, nothing to do with religion, okay? There are other conflicts that I can dredge up, national conflicts, not necessarily violence, but national conflicts that have nothing to do necessarily with faith. I don't think that the Basques and the Catalans in Spain, they're also, I think, Catholic. I don't think that they have a different faith. It's not there's an ethnic and not a religious conflict per se. And so it's not obvious, for example, that the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will be a religious conflict. And when I say that, people like raise eyebrows. I actually can't see you guys, but people raise eyebrows. What are you talking about, Avi? Jews, okay, and Muslims, right? Well, yes and no, because the Zionist movement was a secular movement. Okay, don't look at the religious Zionists that you have today in Israel. They're newcomers. There were precious few of them when Zionism emerged. In fact, most Orthodox Jews were opposed to Zionism. Some were vehemently opposed to it. Some of them were just mildly opposed to it, but there were very few that joined the bandwagon initially. There were some, but they were very few. It was not a religious movement. It was a secular movement, period. Okay? And the truth is that the Palestinian national movement kind of adopted a religious layer, okay, within a decade, okay, of the conflict by 1929, but it was deliberately introduced in order to get the Islamic world on board, okay? And of course, today, 2024, we're facing Hamas, which is a Islamic fundamentalist movement, as is Hezbollah in the north, right? I'm not saying there's no religious element here. I'm saying it's not a foregone conclusion that it had to have had a religious element. There is definitely a religious element in the conflict, but it's not necessarily what informed most of the conflict throughout the conflict. I think that's important for us to say. Okay, so what you're looking at over here, very briefly, we talk about the river, from the river to the sea. We're talking about the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. On the left-hand side, you're seeing a map of British Mandate Palestine, okay? And on the right-hand side, you're seeing the partition plan. Look, very, very briefly, the result of World War I was that the British and the French carved up the Middle East between them for their own purposes. They created states. States emerged under their tutelage. The British made lots of promises to everybody. They promised the Jews and they promised the Arabs. They promised this one and that one. They made a lot of promises, most of which contradicted each other. Okay. At the end of the day, the British ruled what's called British Mandate Palestine for 30 years. They received a mandate to help prepare a Jewish national home. And the truth is that they didn't get in the Zionist way for most of the time. The Zionists were able to build an embryonic state. But also what's going to occur inside British Mandate Palestine is that the Arabs were not invested in state building. all of their energies were invested in preventing the Jews from building an embryonic state, rather than the Palestinians actually investing in building an embryonic state of their own. So one of the big issues that we have, and it's important to talk about, is that when the British, when the British arrived, first of all, one of the results of World War I, the Ottoman Turks killed or exiled about 100,000 Arabs, and you had like about 25,000 Jews who were either killed or exiled by the Ottoman Turks. So both populations in 1918 were smaller than they had been in 1913. But let's say by 1922, okay, beginning of the British Mandate officially, okay, you're looking at 85,000 Jews, and you're looking at something like it was like 550,000, something like that, Arabs. Now, there's an overwhelming Arab majority and a small Jewish minority. Okay, and I think what's very, very important to say is the following. And I think that you need to just use common sense for a second. It was simply not possible for Jews to come, not during the Ottoman period from 1882 to 1913, okay, the beginning of Zionism, okay, and certainly not after World War I until 1948. Jews came, they didn't have power, they didn't have weapons, they didn't have a lot of money, they couldn't take land away from the Arabs. It simply wasn't possible and not plausible. What the Zionists did was they purchased land, good money, from what was primarily absentee Arab landlords who sold what they considered to be not good land. Marshlands, swampy areas, malarial areas, sandy and rocky areas where there were very few Arabs because it wasn't considered arable, cultivatable land. And the Zionists, through a lot of sweat, turned these lands into very arable, cultivatable. They cultivated them and were very successful. But no land was taken away from the Arabs up until the war in 48. Okay, this has to be said. So, because it wasn't even possible. First of all, the authorities, whether the Ottoman Turks or the British, wouldn't allow them to do it. Secondly, they didn't have the power to do it. How could 20,000 people take away from 1 million people? It doesn't make sense. Okay, it just defies logic, and it's simply factually incorrect. Okay, but what happens is when we get to 1947, and again, if World War I is a game changer, or reshuffling the deck, no more Ottoman Empire, the British and French divvy up, okay, as they see fit. Okay, World War II is another game changer, because World War II, three things emerge. Number one, we had the Holocaust, very important. Number two, we now have entered into the American century. If you didn't realize it before World War II, after World War II is the American century. And the British, this is number three, the British are bankrupt. They're actually brighter than the French because they understand relatively quickly. It takes them 2 years to understand that they're no longer the British Empire, and they very quickly decolonize. The French need to get their cans kicked a little bit, okay, like Indochina, okay, and Algeria, and they figure it out as well, but it takes them an extra decade, okay? But the British and French are no longer colonial powers, no longer world powers after World War II, okay? It's now all about a bipolar world. I'm not talking psychology, I'm talking about the Cold War, the United States on one side, the USSR on the other, okay? This is what emerges after World War II, and this is a game changer as well. By 1947, the British have had it. They can't solve the problems between Arabs and Jews. They hand it over to the UN, and the UN is going to decide to partition the country to 2 states. And what you see on the right-hand side is their partition plan. Okay, the Jewish state is what you see there in blue, and much of it is in the south, in Negev. It's desert. Okay, no Jerusalem for the Jews. Okay, Jerusalem is going to be internationalized. So what you can see here is not exactly the Jewish Zionist fantasy, but this is 2.5 years after the Holocaust. The Jews needed the state yesterday, and they say yes. And the Arabs completely reject this plan and initiate the war in 48. And I realize that I am no way going to have to get to this whole thing, but I've got to do the best I can. Okay, so skip this because it's less important. So causes, okay, from the Palestinian side. Why are they rejecting partition? It ain't fair. The whole thing belongs to us. Okay, 1947, there are slightly less than 1.3 million Palestinians. Okay? There are 600,000 Jews. The Jews own like less than 10% of the land. I was like, this is not fair. It's simply unfair. Number one. Number two, and now we bring religion in. Palestine is Islamic land. No way can we have a Jewish state here. Okay, this is imperialism. Okay, and we oppose this entirely. Okay, this is the Arab position here. Okay, what do the Jews say? We're a nation in a national sense. Okay, we've kept our connection up for thousands of years. The international community also recognizes that we deserve self-determination, independence, and the Holocaust proved unequivocally that we need it. Okay, now the general Arab view, and this is important to understand, okay, is that first of all, the Arab street, whether we're talking about Syria or Lebanon or Iraq or Jordan or Egypt, the Arab street was opposed to a Jewish state. Okay, very, very important. They also felt that there shouldn't be a Jewish state there because it's Islamic country, it's Islamic land. Okay, it had been Islamic land. The first half of the war is between the Jewish and Arab communities in Palestine without the Arab nations, the neighboring countries involved. And during the war, you're going to have the creation, already the first half of the war, you're going to start to have about 300,000 Palestinian refugees. And you're going to have a story of Deir Yassin, which I don't have time to go into right now. But generally speaking, the Arabs felt they had to intervene. Okay, but also they were interested in grabbing land. The Arab countries were very interested in grabbing land. The truth is, and we take a look at this story, Jordan captured much of what was supposed to be Palestinian state, and they didn't create one, but they rather annexed that territory. But what I realize now is I have to jump off the stuff because we simply don't have the time. Okay, I think that I'm going to get to the bottom line of this. Okay, we take a look at this war in 48, where the first half of the war is between the Arab and Jewish communities of Palestine. It's a civil war, which the Jews win by the 14th of May, by the time, and the British were present throughout that entire civil war. Okay, second half of the war, we have 5 Arab armies that are going to invade a nascent, brand spanking new Jewish state of Israel. At the end of the day, we have winners and losers. So let's start talking about winners. 2 big winners in this conflict were Jordan and Israel. Why is Jordan a big winner? Because Jordan captures East Jerusalem. Very importantly, the third holy site to Islam, the Temple Mount, or the Haram Sharif, the noble sanctuary. Very important to Jordan till today. And they also capture the West Bank. They got very, very good. Most of Jordan is deserts. They got very good arable, cultivatable land. Okay, the Jordanians were big winners. Israel was a big winner because we survived, and we actually, when the dust settled in 1949, we had a slightly larger country than what had been allotted to us in the partition plan. So in that sense, these are the two big winners. The biggest losers were obviously the Palestinians, who lost everything. So first of all, out of a population of almost 1.3 million, okay, on the eve of the war, about 750,000 became refugees. Okay, big disaster for them. They lost everything, lost their homes, livelihood. Okay, and so that's a huge loss, and for them, they call this war the catastrophe. Egypt captured the Gaza Strip, which wasn't worth a lot to them, but it was kind of humiliating that they lost. The Syrians also captured a little bit of territory, so they didn't feel like big losers, but they weren't really big winners either. And Lebanon was pushed back to its borders, and the Iraqis basically went back home. Okay, I think it's important. Jerusalem became a divided city. Okay, and Jerusalem became a core issue, which it had been before. Okay, that's why the UN took it off the table, but Jerusalem was divided for 19 years. Okay, I think that we need to talk for a second about the Palestinian refugees, because this is a core issue, okay, in the conflict. And I really do this as briefly as possible, okay? So very, very briefly put, Some of the Palestinians became refugees because the first wave were intellectuals and the moneyed class, who as soon as war came close to them, they left because they could leave. And this, by the way, caused the collapse of Palestinian Arab society because the wealthy and the intellectual class left in the lurch. I'm talking about in the first 2 months of the war. You had some Palestinians who fled the fighting itself that was coming very close to their homes. You had some Palestinians who were forced out of their homes by Israelis, who were evicted, okay, deliberately. Okay, so these are the different causes or reasons of their becoming displaced. They remain displaced because the countries that they fled into refused to receive them. And the overwhelming majority fled to Arab countries, which refused to absorb them, give them citizenship, but maintain them as foreigners in refugee camps. Okay, what was a number of about 750,000 in 1948 by the end of the war, okay, has blossomed and bloomed now to about over 5 million because the Palestinian refugees, in contrast to virtually other refugees around the world, the refugee status is passed down generationally, even if they're absorbed into a country and receive citizenship. So Professor Edward Said, who was a Palestinian refugee and became a professor at Columbia University and was an American citizen, and his children were born in the United States as US citizens, his kids and his grandkids are refugees officially. Okay, so you see this is a bit of an issue. It's a big issue. The refugee issue has become a very strong element of Palestinian national identity. And I would say, although it is a big difference, there's a huge difference, so please don't take what I'm going to say now the wrong way. The way that, it's not for everybody, but there are many Jews, the Holocaust became a part of Jewish identity. It's not for all Jews, okay? It's not the same thing at all. I'm just making a parallel between how a traumatic event can actually become part of a national identity. I'm not comparing the events themselves. They're totally different from each other, okay? In a like fashion, the refugee issue has become part of Palestinian identity, okay? All right. So we need to, by the way, and it has to be said, that parallel to all this, you're going to have close to 600,000 Jews will be evicted from Arab lands, Muslim lands, okay? And you have in Israel, more than that were evicted actually, but that's the number that actually came to Israel. You had 700,000 that went to other countries, okay? So a Jewish presence in the Middle East that had been there for millennia was erased overnight, basically between 1948 and 1960. Next big turning point, 6-Day War, okay? Big drama. And here, just in terms of its causes, first of all, the Soviet Union was actually stirring the pot. Number one, the things they were doing, they were actually supplying fairly sophisticated weaponry to the Egyptians and to the Syrians. Pan-Arabism was strengthened by Nasser, who was the leader of Egypt. You had a lot of regimes collapse before the 6-Day War, Arab regimes, because none of the regimes that emerged after World War II, Arab countries, none of them were democracies. They were very unstable. There was a conflict between Israel and Syria over water sources. The Syrians tried to divert the headwaters of the Jordan River in order to prevent Israel from utilizing the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River as a water source. Israel evidently, although Israel never admitted to it, gained a nuclear capacity even before 1967. Okay, very important for us to keep that in mind. And there was also friction. There was ongoing friction between Israel and Jordan because of terrorists that were coming in and attacking Israelis coming across. Either way, Nasser made a huge error. Okay, it was goaded into this war, not by Israel, but by other Arab states. And I think that when we talk about turning point, the 6-Day War is as big a turning point as 1948. First of all, we can see that Israel is going to capture from the Egyptians the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip, from Jordan, Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, and from the Syrians, the Golan Heights. Okay, the Arab countries that were involved in this, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, were completely humiliated. They lost face, which is very, very important in the Middle East, in this culture. They lost face, lost their honor. But, and this is perhaps more important than everything I said right now, was that between 1948 and 1967, the Palestinian issue had been kind of swept off the table. It was about the Arab-Israeli conflict and not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And in the wake of the Six-Day War, where Israel now controlled millions of Palestinians in either the West Bank or the Gaza Strip, the Palestinian issue becomes front and center once again. And this is very, very important as a result. Okay. Other results that Israelis became very arrogant. Hubris was will be the downfall. And we're also going to have Israel gaining control over holy sites to the Jewish faith. Some of them were also holy sites to the Islamic faith. So that was that also puts the religious issue even more on the table, Israel gets strategic depth, whether we're talking about here in the south, the Sinai Peninsula, or we're talking about in the north with Golan Heights, or we're talking about the West Bank. Okay, we get strategic depth of what we didn't have before 67. Okay, but also we are actually willing to give back. Let's go back here. We actually floated to the Egyptians and to the Syrians that we would give back territory for normalization that would lead to peace. We did not make the same offer to the Jordanians vis-a-vis the West Bank and East Jerusalem, but the offer was rejected. You have the famous three no's, the Khartoum Conference, the Arab League's conference of September 67, no peace, no negotiations, and no recognition of Israel. You're also going to have UN Security Council Resolution 242, which is very interesting because while it talks about Israel withdrawing from territories, it didn't say the territory, it said territories, okay? Which meant that it was enough wiggle room that Israel could sign on to it, but it also talks about that everybody has a right to live in peace and secure and recognized boundaries. And so this is kind of very, very important Security Council resolution. 30 seconds. This is the topography when I go, where my cursor is from west to east. Okay, what you see here where Jerusalem is on the central mountain massif, and east of there we have this is obviously exaggerated, we have the Rift Valley, the Jordan Valley, okay, this is very, very low, and then you cross over and you have the high mountains in Jordan. Essentially, what you're seeing is the following. When we take a look where my cursor is over here, which says the coastal plain, 80% of Israeli citizens and 80% of Israeli economic industrial infrastructure was located in the coastal plain, literally underneath, physically under the Jordanians that were sitting on top here of the mountain. Okay, and so this is why we didn't make the offer to Jordan, but this is the strategic reason, if you will, the strategic reason why Israel embarked on building settlements in this area. Okay, and what you can see here in front of you, if you look to the right, because this is kind of, I think it's more visually, it's easier to grasp this. All the blue blotches, if you will, are Israeli settlements in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and all the green are Palestinians. So it's kind of a Swiss cheese over here, and you see that the settlements are all over the place. Okay, on the left-hand side, it's showing you all of the again, Arab and no, sorry, all of the settlements over here by size. Okay, so to make a long story short, Israel embarked on sending Israeli Jews to live in communities in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank, starting from 1967. It took off in a big way within a decade from 1977 forward. Today in 2024, we're looking at approximately 500,000 Israeli Jews live in settlements in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria. Okay, there are close to 3 million Palestinians. Okay, living also in the West Bank and Judea and Samaria. Okay, and the settlement issue is considered a very, very important issue in the conflict, specifically between the Israelis and the Palestinians, but not only. Okay, and so this is only post 1967. So, and here, when we talk about occupation, okay, talking about Israel occupying this area, meaning capturing it. The official Israeli line is that it's not occupied because it was occupied by the Jordanians first, and we occupied an occupied territory. So it's a disputed territory. Okay, but the Israeli legal system actually looks at it through the lens of looks at through the lens of a sorry about that. Looks at through the lens of what they call belligerent occupation. Okay, but officially it's not an occupation. Now I'm saying that to you because now we're hearing people say 75 years of Israeli occupation. That sentence means, whoever said the sentence means that Israel doesn't have a right to exist anywhere between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, because 75 years is 1948. Okay, so I just wanted to put that out there so we understand our terminology. Next turning point, Yom Kippur War. Okay, Yom Kippur War, game changer. Israel is caught with its pants down, like October 7th, like this past October 7th. What's very interesting is evidently the Egyptians didn't plan to go very far. They stopped on their own accord. They weren't stopped by Israel. They stopped on their own accord. The Assyrians had bigger plans, but they were not very successful. What this war did, essentially, was Israel began to recognize the limits of its military power. The hubris that emerged from 67 was cut down to size in 73. It enabled Israel and Egypt to launch a peace process. And here, the United States' involvement with Kissinger was a significant element in this because the Soviets were supplying the Egyptians. They were airlifting the supplies. The Americans were supplying the Israelis with arms. Israel crossed the Suez Canal and encircled an entire army. 40,000 Egyptians were totally surrounded. But Kissinger basically said, you got to stop now. You don't stop, we're stopping the supply. Kissinger preferred a situation where Israel had encircled the Egyptian army, but the Egyptians were also on the Israeli side. So if you will, stalemate, so that the Egyptians were not humiliated. And we can start a peace process, which actually played out, as we know. Big dividend of the Yom Kippur War, which I think a lot of Israelis don't know this, and maybe people outside the country don't know this. For sure, the decade after the Yom Kippur War, economic Israel is called the lost decade because the country stood still, didn't grow, the economy didn't grow at all. But that has nothing to do with it. It's connected to the war, but it's more connected to the fact that the country had to merge from being a socialist country to being a capitalistic one, which it did after 1985. But what's going to happen is one of the big dividends for Israel was by removing Egypt, the strongest and biggest Arab nemesis, from the table. Israel, over time, certainly starting in the early 80s, could dramatically reduce how much of the GDP was being spent on defense. And we dropped from right after the war up to close to 30%, and we dropped down to 13% over the course of a decade and a half, which is dramatic because a lot of that money could be then put into the health system, educational system. Was a big dividend. Both Egypt and Israel began to receive huge economic aid from the United States, and that was also a big deal. And this peace treaty is actually held. Okay, Israel and Syria disengaged. Syria still considers a big enemy, but up until the collapse of Syria into a civil war in 2011, we had 35 years of quiet on the Israeli-Syrian frontier from, let's say, 1975 until 2011. Did I screw up the math? Maybe. Okay, no, 1975 to 2011, that's about 35 years. So about 35 years of quiet. It's actually perhaps our quietest border, okay, until all hell broke loose over there. Next week, I'm going to be talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I'm going to leapfrog over the things you're seeing over here. What is important is the following. 1979, we have the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and Iran immediately becomes a player. Iran humiliates the United States with the hostage crisis, and it puts the entire Arab and Muslim world into a lot of glee, and it's going to radicalize. It's going to radicalize, and you're going to be seeing, by the way, in the early 1980s, the emergence of the Islamic Jihad, a Palestinian Sunni terror organization that was basically formed under the aegis of the Iranian Shiites. Hamas didn't exist yet. Okay, so this is 1979, very important. 1982, because the Palestinians had controlled southern Lebanon, just very briefly, Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982. And the result of that was 18 years of an Israeli presence in southern Lebanon, but also this is when Hezbollah is going to emerge. Okay, Hezbollah is going to be created by Iran, and little by little, it's become a very, very formidable enemy of Israel's. I want to touch on the first Gulf War literally for 30 seconds, because the importance of the first Gulf War, even though theoretically Israel was not involved in that, we only had 41 Scuds that were shot at us. The first Gulf War woke us up to the importance of missiles. Okay, in other words, a missiles arms race and developing missile defense systems, offensive and defensive systems, are a result of the first Gulf War. The fact that Israelis have safe spaces has to do it. I'm talking about fortified safe spaces, which is supposed to be saving us if missiles fall on us, is a result of the first Gulf War, where we had Scuds being shot at us. We had no safety, and the building code changed after that. Okay, so that's kind of important. And we also began to develop all kinds of sophisticated technologies to deal with incoming missiles. I think I'm gonna stop on 2 points now and open up the Q&A. In the year 2000, summer of 2000, Israel, after 18 years in southern Lebanon, pulled out lock, stock, and barrel. We did it unilaterally. We told the UN, you demarcate the border, and we will go back to the international border. Want to be holier than the Pope? We came back to the international border. 3 days after we did that, Hezbollah shot across, killed 3 Israeli soldiers and dragged their dead bodies into Lebanon. Okay, so this is in 2000. Same summer, or actually, yeah, same summer, you had the collapse of the Oslo process. Camp David collapsed. And in September, we had the outbreak of the second Intifada, which is very, very important to understand the Israeli psyche. But in 2005, at the tail end of the second Intifada, Israel is going to pull up lock, stock, and barrel from the Gaza Strip. And we're going to talk a lot about that next week. Following year, in 2006, when Hezbollah again attacks, kills 8 Israeli soldiers on the Israeli side, and drags 2 badly wounded soldiers who died in captivity into Lebanon, Israel is going to embark on the second Lebanon war with Hezbollah. Okay, I'm going to sum up now, and then open up to Q&A. See, I think there are a lot of questions there. I haven't looked at them, but there must be a lot of questions. From 1979, we're going to start to see Iran initially punch above its weight, but it's really going to begin to assemble proxies, first and foremost Shiite proxies, okay, in the entire region. And we come down to where we are now, and certainly in the last decade for sure, much of the Middle East today is divided between Iran and its proxies. So that would mean Iran and its proxies in Iraq, and its proxies in Syria, and Hezbollah, and the Houthis in Lebanon. Okay, and they're mixing things up in Libya as well. And facing off against them are Sunni regimes, which the United States likes to call moderate regimes. I'm not sure how moderate they are, but moderate Sunni regimes. For example, Turkey. I'm not sure how moderate Turkey is. Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, okay, Jordan. So these are part of a so-called Sunni axis, and the parts of the Sunni axis, like Egypt and Jordan, have full peace treaties with Israel. So you also, the Abraham Accords, also Sunni states, and they actually have peace with Israel, and Israel's kind of considered to be part of that axis, if you will. Okay, and literally in this past few months, we're finding Russia and China to a certain extent have also, I wouldn't say have joined, but they're being supportive of the Shiite axis for their own reasons. So now we're back to not the Cold War, but the US is now supportive of the Sunni one, and Russia and China of the Shiite one. So this is also an important thing to us to look at and take account of and to realize. Another important issue is that oil is not important anymore. Or let's put it this way, the importance of oil, certainly to the United States, okay, has gone down dramatically. And that's also a game changer in terms of how much the United States would really want to invest its efforts in this area if it wasn't dragged here against its will. And this is also something very, very important for us to keep in mind. And finally, the religious element has risen dramatically in the last 25 years on both sides of the conflict, on the Israeli side and on the Arab side. And that's not good for business. So I don't know if this is satisfactory, but I kind of knew that this was almost mission impossible. But now I'm going to engage your questions, and hopefully I'll have some decent answers. Okay. Let's go from the top. Lots of questions here. Okay, so Doris asked a whole slew of questions, so I'll do it as best I can. So the question, I think the major question is that Doris asking, why did the Arabs fall so far behind? Okay, it's actually a very, very good question. Part of it has to do with the fact that the Arabs, first of all, were not unified. They found themselves under the rule of what was initially a very dynamic, very creative Ottoman Empire. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the Ottoman Empire was really, really number one. Okay, and they were terrifying Europe. The Ottoman Turks only began to focus on education in the 19th century, kind of late in the game, the second half of the 19th century. So many Arabs found themselves to be, first of all, illiterate. The printing press only arrived in the Arab countries in the Arab area, okay, in the 19th century, and primarily, mostly from the second half of the 19th century. It's also very important dissemination also of ideas. So there was a problem of education. There's something else which people don't talk about because it's not maybe politically correct, but I'm going to put it out there. You had the Protestant Reformation. And part of the Protestant Reformation was to translate the prayer book and liturgy from Latin into German initially, okay, because people didn't know Latin anymore. And what it did was it gave people agency. If you were literate in German, you can now understand the biblical text. You can now understand the prayer book. It loosened the reins of control of the Catholic Church. Okay, that's one of the big things. And you look at the Protestant countries, okay, that emerged, okay, after the Reformation. A lot of them became very, very dynamic and economically successful, and to a large degree more successful than most of the Catholic countries. I don't want to say anything bad about Catholicism because it's not really true, because France is a Catholic country, very, very important, okay? But there was something very dynamic about that. It engendered more education and engendered a progress. Judaism also underwent a reform, a kind of reformation in the 19th century, very, very similar, translating the prayer book and the Hebrew Bible from Hebrew, first into German, like the Protestant Reformation, first in German and then to English, okay, which is very, very important. Islam has never undergone that reform. The largest Islamic country in the world is Indonesia with 220 million Indonesians. If you're a Muslim, you have to pray in Arabic and you have to read the Quran in Arabic. Arabic and the Indonesian language are totally not, they're totally dissimilar, okay? So essentially, most Muslims around the world are not even Arabs. Okay, Turkmen, Persians, look at all Central Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, pick your Kazakhstan, pick your Central Asian stand. None of them are Arab, they're not Arabs, okay? But the Quran and prayer has to be done only in Arabic. So it kind of it made things very, very difficult. And among the Arabs themselves, they were not able to, they didn't make that leap. They haven't had that reform. That reform is important because that reform also engendered over time, more gender equality and so on and so forth. Okay, there was an assumption that the internet was going to be a game changer, and it has to a certain extent, but maybe not necessarily in the right direction. It also is radicalized. When you look at fundamentalism, okay, going back to fundamentals, it rose rather quickly in the Arab Muslim world and became very, very strong in that world as well. Does tribalism conflict with nationalism? Yes, which is why Libya, a lot of the Arab states that were artificially created by the British and French after World War I, they were held together by strong men, literally strong leaders. And in the absence of that, like Saddam Hussein removed, okay, Gaddafi removed, and go on, the whole list, okay, they collapsed into tribal warfare. So yes, tribalism does conflict with nationalism, absolutely. Okay, yes, the majority of Egyptians are Sunni Muslims. Okay. Al's asked the question, were the Ottoman Turks tolerant to their Jewish subjects? The answer is, big picture, yes. Specifically in Istanbul and in Salonika. But when you get to the land of Israel or Palestine, you're in the periphery. You're very, very far from the center of the Ottoman Empire, and they didn't control a lot. So the Jews were basically under the thumbs of the local strongmen, mostly Arab, okay, who were not necessarily tolerant to them. Okay, theoretically under Islam, Jews are supposed to be tolerated. Jews living in Ottoman Palestine until the 19th century were living, it was not easy. There was not a lot of tolerance. Actually, the infiltration of the European powers into Palestine in the 19th century gave Jews more protection, ironically. Okay, so clarify just being Muslim and being a follower of Islam. A Muslim is a follower of Islam. A Muslim, there's different ways, is a follower of Islam. Okay. Muslim means somebody who gives themselves entirely to God's will. That's what Muslim means. Okay. And yes, a Muslim is a follower of Islam. Okay. Arab is an ethnos, it's an ethnic identity, not a religious one. It starts with language, Arabic. It continues with a civilization and culture. And it started in the Arabian Peninsula, which today is Saudi Arabia. And of course, Arabs moved out of that area. Okay. And not just in the Muslim conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries, but even before that, you had Arabs moving around the region before the advent of Islam. Most Arabs are Muslims, but most Muslims are not Arabs. And some of the oldest Christian communities in the world are Arab Christians. The Kurds are a different ethnic group. Their language is not Arabic, it's Kurdish. Regionally, the Kurds are from the areas of today of southern Turkey, northern Syria, and northern Iraq and parts of Iran. Those are the areas where the Kurds are. And not all Kurds are Muslim, as I mentioned before. Okay, so somebody had given feedback from last week that relates to a book. It's a relatively recent book, and it's on the bibliography that I put together. Rashid Khalili's book, which is called The 100 Years' War on Palestine. And in that book, he posits that after each war, the Jews took more land, okay? Which is why people paint them as colonizers. Actually, it's very interesting. It's actually not true that after each war, Jews took the Jews or Israelites took land, because in Yom Kippur War we didn't take land. Okay, and as part of the peace processes that we've had, we actually gave up land. We gave up land. We gave back to Egypt every last centimeter or every last inch that we captured in '67 was given back to the Egyptians. They didn't want the Gaza Strip. We offered them. They didn't want it back. Okay, and we gave back Jordan also land that we had taken from them. So it's actually it's not true. When people talk about Israel as a colonial enterprise, they're trying to say that Jews are coming from Europe and they're settling in the Middle East. They're foreigners, in contrast to the indigenous Arabs. Okay, and we talked about the fact that Jews are indigenous last week. But even putting that aside, when you take a look at Israel, 50% of the country are Jews who were evicted from the Arab countries in the surrounding environment. Okay, colonial empires went there to essentially sent their people there, sent them there to exploit the resources to send back to the mother country, whether it's Britain or France or what have you. Okay, and to subjugate the local population. So nobody sent the Jews. The Jews fled persecution to arrive there. Didn't take the land from the Palestinians, but purchased all the land up until 1948. We're willing to live side by side, two-state solution in 1947. So Jews don't actually fit the colonization claim, but it sounds like a good story. Now, look, in terms of Israeli settlers in the West Bank, what's happening now? So there is a problem, for sure, that there are settlers who are attempting to evict Palestinians from their land. It's even taking place during this war right now. We are in the past, not too distant past, Israeli government did intervene, including tearing down buildings that were built in settlements on private Palestinian land, as per Israeli Supreme Court decisions. We're now living in an era of the most right-wing Israeli government in its history, where we have senior members of the government who are for annexing the territory, and this is a problem. This is a problem. I don't have a problem. I don't represent the state of Israel. I'm not an official of the state of Israel. I don't have a problem criticizing the country where I pay taxes and I vote and I live. Okay, I think it's wrong. I think it's bad. Okay, but this is not the same thing as what Khalidi is saying, because as I mentioned in our opening shot, how could Jews evict Arabs from their land in 1920, 1930, 1940? They couldn't. Jews didn't have power. They weren't in charge. They didn't have military power and they weren't in charge. And they're numerically inferior by all means. Okay. Now we have a problem. There's a problem. And there's some illegal stuff being done, and it has to be taken care of, in my opinion, in my personal opinion. Herzl never emigrated to Palestine. Somebody asked, Doris asked, Herzl never emigrated to Palestine. Herzl visited Palestine once in 1898. He died young. He was 44 years old, died in 1904. His body was exhumed and brought to Israel after the war in 1949, and he was buried on Mount Herzl. Herbert Samuel. Herbert Samuel was a Jewish Zionist, British politician who was sent to be the first High Commissioner of Palestine under the British. And he bent over backwards to be impartial. So he took the most radical Islamic Palestinian leader, the Grand Mufti al-Husseini, this guy Abd al-Husseini, and made him into the Grand Mufti, which gave him a lot of control over Islamic purse strings in the country, and an attempted bear hug, and that was quite a big mistake. That was certainly a big mistake, and he caused a lot of problems. The initial British, no, what's going to happen is, the question here is, did the British mandate include the area of Transjordan? The answer is yes and no. what happened was the following. The Hashemites, who were actually allied with the British in World War One, revolted against the Ottoman Turks, and Abdallah, one of the Hashemites, with his forces, gained control of Transjordan. And in 1920, Churchill made the decision to dissociate, to disconnect Transjordan from Palestine. Okay, it wouldn't be part of the mandate. He was basically, to a certain extent, ratifying or affirming a situation on the ground. The Hashemites controlled the country, and he basically, it was King Abdullah remained the king there under the tutelage of the British, and eventually after World War II, they received independence from the British, but it was not part of the mandate. He dissociated. Churchill removed Transjordan from that story. Okay, I'm being asked about the San Remo conference. Is going to be taking place after World War I. It's going to determine the parameters of the mandates to a certain extent. Look, the reality on the ground is that the British and the French basically divided up the Middle East between them, and the League of Nations, the precursor of the UN, more or less ratified what the British and French wanted. In terms of delineating the official borders, that took place in 1923 and 1924, after you already had a French mandate over Lebanon and Syria, and a British mandate over Palestine. It's called the Polay-Newcomb agreement. These two guys actually went on the ground and delineated the border between British mandate Palestine and Lebanon and Syria, okay, which is supposed to be the international line till today, theoretically. The question is, why did Egypt fight in these wars? So, look, as I mentioned before, we look at the war in 48, the Egyptian street, the Arab street there, was radicalized, not the government at the time, and they were pushing very, very hard. The Egyptians also, and one thing has to be made clear here, which I didn't make clear, I think, at the beginning of the lecture. We look at 1948 and the Arab players who were invading Israel. Much of the effort was to try to prevent the other Arab states from grabbing more territory. So the Egyptians, for example, tried to prevent the Jordanians from taking East Jerusalem. They split their force. Their main force was heading, the Egyptian main force was heading for Tel Aviv, but they had a secondary force which head for Jerusalem to try to actually prevent the Jordanians from being successful there. So as strange as it sounds, they were at cross purposes to a certain extent. After humiliation of 48, Egypt certainly saw Israel as an enemy. Nasser, who will depose as part of this free officers corps that deposed King Farouk in 1952 and takes over, very charismatic Arab leader, and he saw a way of, he was big, a promoter of pan-Arabism, obviously where Egypt would be the leader of that. And one way of getting the other Arab countries on board was to have a common enemy, which is Israel. And that's why Egypt was very much involved in that. Okay. So Julie's asking the question about the unique refugee inheritance of the Palestinians and the issue of a specific UN body that deals with Palestinians, UNRWA. Can it be addressed? Look, UNRWA right now is taking it on the chin, if you've been following news the last 2 days, because it turned out that at least 12 UNRWA employees committed atrocities in October 7th. And it's very clear that UNRWA is totally, a lot of Hamas and Islam Jihad in UNRWA. In terms of the issue or question of Palestinian refugees, their status going, from generation to generation, I think that it's more symbolic than anything else. It doesn't have meaning. If you're in America, if you're a Palestinian American, you're American, and you're living in America. And at this point, you've got third and fourth generation Palestinian Americans, right? In 75 years. third generation in 75 years. And that's true of Canadian Palestinians and Australian Palestinians and British Palestinians and what have you. Okay, so they're not going to leave where they're going. Number one. Number two, the truth is that Palestinian refugee issue is an issue. But when we did have peace talks, there appeared to be formulae, that's formulas in plural, that were tabled where the Palestinians and Israelis were moving towards, were meeting each other, halfway, but we're starting to find some kind of creative solutions to that. It was very, very clear to the Palestinians that, I mean, on a practical level, that Israel was not going to accept into Israel proper Palestinian refugees. What the Palestinians were going to do in the event of a two-state solution. We're talking about before 2014, last time we had peace negotiations, but before then, we're talking about something like that. Israel was not talking about taking refugees into Israel proper. And there were questions about compensation, something symbolic, recognition, and so on and so forth. So it's not a insolvable problem. That's not even the biggest problem. I think it's important to understand that it is deeply part of the Palestinian identity and has to be addressed some way. Okay. So when Lynn's asking, when they're seen as refugees, when you count today Palestinian refugees, it's like, do a Google search, it's like upwards of 5 million. It's like, how's that possible? Because in 48, there was 750,000. So how do we get to 5 million now, right? Now you understand how, but it's impracticable. And, it's the Arab states that are interested in normalization or already have peace with Israel talk about some kind of recognition, and not that Israel would have to take that. There has to be something that is an agreed upon solution, not something that's rammed on Israel. Okay, so I think I wouldn't spend that much time on it. So Israel didn't really offer the West Bank to Jordan because of the topography, what I explained to you before. After 67, Jordan was still our enemy. Jordan stopped being our enemy in 1970. Okay, and I will address that next week. A big dramatic event that happened that relates to the Palestinians that took place in September of 1970. And from 1970 to 1994, for 24 years, there was a tacit de facto peace between Israel and Jordan. It only became de jure with the signing of peace in 1994. But in 67, 68, 69, Jordan was still an enemy state. And to have an enemy state, perched above, your country, above most of your population, most of your industrial infrastructure was just something Israel couldn't suffer. And by the way, in the beginning of the Six-Day War, Jordan was shelling Tel Aviv, was shelling Netanya on the West Bank. Okay, that was just simply unacceptable. So we really didn't make a serious offer to them. We made a more serious offer to the Egyptians and the Syrians, and they turned it down. Okay, so look, this is the last question I'm going to deal with now, just because of our time framework. Doris is asking the question. I'm going to read the whole question. Given the Swiss cheese of the settlements in the West Bank, how could a Palestinian state be created without land swaps? And would people agree to that? Why does Israel sanction armed invasions by Jews into Palestinian settlements? Okay, so number one, I have to make it very, very clear. Public opinion surveys that came out last week, both among Israelis and Palestinians, show that less than a third of Israelis and less than a third of Palestinians are for a two-state solution. So a two-state solution right now, at this moment in time, is only possible if it is an imposed solution from the outside. And I don't even see how it could be imposed. Okay? I'm not opposed to it, but I'm telling you that it's not something that's practicable or that could happen at this very moment if it would not be imposed from the outside. Okay? That's number one. Number two, regarding the settlements, a formula was created, an agreed upon formula was created between Israelis and Palestinian negotiators. When Israelis and Palestinians were negotiating, there is a formula. Okay, the settlements do not, per se, do not make a Palestinian state impossible. Okay, if there's goodwill on both sides, it's certainly there is a formula. The formula has to do with Israel annexing 80% of the settlers who were living very, very close to Israel, okay, and the Palestinians acquiescing to that annexation, and then Palestinians get for that, okay, land in Israel, okay, and that's something that, and the other 20% of the settlers have to be removed, okay. So this is something that kind of it was an acceptable formula when there were negotiations. There are no negotiations today. You don't have to. You have a partner. You don't have a partner on either side of the story, okay. And in terms of Israel sanctioning armed invasions, Israel's not sanctioning. Israel's just not stopping it. I know it sounds like the same thing, but it's not. And as I mentioned, Israel has the most right-wing religious government in its 75-year history. The government has been in power for slightly less than 1 year. They took their seats at the end of December 2022. Wait, I'm sorry. They're slightly more than 1 year. I just lost myself. We're in 2024. It's slightly more than 1 year old. Okay, it's a year and 1.1 year old. Okay, it's slightly over 1 year old. Okay, and you have senior members in the Israeli government who have been always opposed to a Palestinian state, who would like to annex either all the territories or large parts of them, and would also like to evict or exile large Palestinian populations. This doesn't mean that all Israelis think this way, okay? And they're not even a majority in their own government, but they have senior positions in the government. So the government is not encouraging, okay, or sending people to do it, but they're not preventing it. And they should be, but they're not, okay? Why? Because you have a very radical right-wing government right now in power. Okay, that's the answer. Thank you for joining us. I don't know if this was satisfactory. It was kind of a big, not complaining, I'm not excuses, but it was a very, very big kind of gamble to put what I usually do in 10 45-minute sessions into one session that's less than an hour and a half. Next week, the focus is going to be on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and obviously with a great focus on what brought us to where we are at this moment, where we are at this moment next week, and also different scenarios, how this might play out. Next week, I'll be broadcasting from Pittsburgh. I'll be in the States the entire month of February, and I'll be in Pittsburgh. And if those are in Pittsburgh, you should check out. I'll be doing different presentations in different places. So you can see if some of them, not too many, but some of them open to the general public, not too many of them. So you can go on the website and check that out, or ask Kate, contact Kate by email. So thank you for joining us. I hope this was useful to you, and I will see hopefully all of you next week. Kate, back to you.
Thank you, Avi, for your expertise today, and I know that we'll learn just as much in our final session next Sunday. In a moment, I'm going to drop into the chat a link that you can use to sign up for next Sunday's Zoom at 1 o'clock. And as Avi just mentioned, he will be in town for the week of February 4th. Consequently, if you want to join us for a public event on February 5th or February 7th, you can register for all of these events at the link I have just dropped into the chat. We're grateful for your engagement today, and I want you to know that we will follow up with an email that includes a reading list from Avi and his PowerPoint after he has time to edit it so that it can be the best possible resource for you. Lastly, donations are gratefully accepted at the link I am posting in the chat. And with that, I thank you for joining us today and bid you all adieu. I hope that you stay well and warm if you're in Pittsburgh, dry if you're in Pittsburgh, it looks like. Thank you, everybody.